How's that for a slice of fried gold?
Oh, you think this is a fucking costume? This is a way of life.
I'll be back.
Just a flesh wound. I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm just gonna bash your brains.
Take your stinking paws off me, you damn dirty ape!
I'm sorry, Ben. I'm afraid I can't do that.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
I guess everyone's entitled to one good scare, huh?
You know what I told myself early on that I was going to have the intro to this. I was going to go back and listen to it, and type it down, and I would memorize it, and I didn't. So here we are.
Then I didn't.
Yep. So hello.
Here we are. Then I didn't.
Yep. So hello.
200 episodes of the last podcast, and you never memorized it.
That's true. Well, hello. And welcome to the Psychotronic Film Society.
He's got that part down.
No, I don't, because I just said the Psychotronic
the
Film
wrong
Society.
podcast.
But slightly disheartened. Just, well, hello.
Well,
here we are.
God help me. This is Cinema Shock. And we celebrate genre film. We educate you and tell you all about a movie each week. And as such, we will do the same this week.
Wow, that just
Rolls off the tongue.
just rolls off the tongue. It really does.
Yeah. If they weren't on board before,
Man,
They are now.
we're putting that entire part on a t-shirt. That's going to be our new slogan.
Well, hey, I'm one of your hosts, Gary Horde. It's good to see you guys.
I'm Justin Bishop, and we are joined this week by special guest, writer,
God damn it.
comedian,
He is not a special guest anymore.
writer, and comedian. And I didn't have one for this week.
oh,
But you know what, though? Titles don't matter, Todd. It's what
that's
you
true.
do that defines you.
That's true.
Todd,
And what I
speaking of
decided to
which,
do-
have you hosted a bar mitzvah yet?
Since last week,
I keep putting it out there that I'm available for bar mitzvahs, and I keep getting silence.
so the female version of a bar mitzvah is a
Bat
bat
mitzvah.
mitzvah. Bat mitzvah.
Is it bat or bot?
I'm saying bat because we're talking about Batman this week.
Oh, well,
See-
okay.
See what I did there?
Yeah. No, that's what a good host does.
But yes, it is a bot.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's what a good host does. He mangles foreign languages. It's what we do weekly
go.
here on the Cinema Shock podcast. Honestly,
Welcome.
This is good. I like this start.
It's
so
authentic.
this week we're doing something fun. We're moving on from horror for a few weeks. These series, Todd is not as into. I guess I don't want to say you're not a horror guy, Todd. I don't want to say that. But I want to say that you mostly like a specific type of horror. I'd say you don't get as deep into the genre as me and Gary might.
I think that's fair. And don't get me wrong, it's not that I'm not willing to deep dive, but if I'm going for just me, I'll go with the classics. I'll go with the tried and true. I'll go with the cream of the crop, as you might.
Are we doing a Macho Man Randy Savage bit?
Yeah, there you go. Let me tell you something. That's the wrong
Hulk
guy.
Hogan.
I fucked that
You're
up.
the wrong guy.
I fucked that
Right
up.
guy.
Sorry. I'm not on the NWA podcast.
Bonesaw is ready.
There you
it
go.
is.
That's better.
And a
That's
comic
better.
book crossover. Very nice.
Yes.
So yes, that's what we're doing this week. Is we're having a comic book episode, a comic book series, only for 3 weeks. I'm sure we'll tackle some other comic book stuff somewhere in the future. We've done almost straight horror for the last 10 weeks, with the exception, I guess, of Night Riders, but that's kind of a niche little film. But we wanted to establish, since we're a new entity here at the Cinema Shock podcast, that we're not just a horror podcast. We wanted to make that clear by not doing 2 horror series right there in a row. We are going to do a lot of horror movies because me and Gary love them, and there's a lot of really fun, weird stuff in that genre, probably more so than any other. But we are also going to be doing, action, sci-fi, things like that. We're not going to do a ton of mainstream movies like we're going to be doing for the next few weeks, but we do want to establish that those are open. We're open to the possibility of doing those. And we also kind of wanted to establish that not every series that we do is going to be focused on a filmmaker's full filmography like we did with the Romero Savini series. Sometimes we're going to be doing themed series where all the movies focused on a filmmaker's full filmography, like we did with the Romero Savini series. Sometimes we're going to be doing themed series where all the movies kind of fit into a theme, and sometimes we're going to be doing franchises. This franchise that we're doing happens to also be all from the same director, but we're not, of course, looking at all of Christopher Nolan's filmography. We're instead looking at just these specific films within it for now. I'm sure at some point in the future we may discuss some of his other films, but for now we're just discussing his take on the comic book genre.
And I'm super excited because Batman aside, like, Chris Nolan's a really great director. He's got a great crew of folks that he works with regularly, and they make good movies. So I'm down.
Yeah. So I'll give you a little history lesson here, Todd. I'm sure you've never heard any of this before. I'm not going to get into the creation of Batman and Bob Kane.
So I'm down.
Yeah. So I'll give you a little history lesson here, Todd. I'm sure you've never heard any of this before. I'm not going to get into the creation of Batman and Bob Kane and what was the other guy?
Bill Finger.
Bill Finger.
Yep.
What the hell are we doing here then?
Well, I mean, listen, Batman's history goes back all the way to the late 1930s. So there's a lot of history there. He also has a pretty long history on film, which dates back almost as long as his comic book appearance. His first on-screen appearance dated back to 1943, which is just 4 years after his creation. That was in a 15-chapter serial produced by Columbia Pictures. There was another one that was produced in the late 1940s as well. He's proven to be, in my opinion, possibly the most popular comic book character of all time. I don't know that many people would argue that. Maybe some people would argue Superman, but I would argue that Batman is in the mainstream even more popular than Superman. And to date, he has appeared. There's a lot of Batman content out there, is what we're saying.
Definitely no shortage of content.
But I would say that the most popular iteration of the character, at least in the eyes of mainstream moviegoers, is the version that Christopher Nolan introduced to the world 15 years ago with Batman Begins.
How do you know my name? The world is too small for someone like Bruce Wayne to disappear.
Your parents' death was not your fault.
My parents deserve justice. I cannot let that pass. If you make yourself more than just a man, then you become something else entirely. Which is a legend, Mr. Wayne.
Master Wayne, are you coming back for long, sir?
As long as it takes to show the people of Gotham their city doesn't belong to the criminals and the corrupt.
Guy dresses up like a bat clearly has issues.
God, it's weird to think about that it was 15 years.
Bat clearly has issues.
God, it's weird to think about that it was 15 years ago. You said at the top that we were discussing something more mainstream, and then when you see, God, 15 years ago, God, it's been that long.
It's been 15 years as of this past June.
Yeah.
And hell, we'll be coming up on 10 years for Dark Knight Rises here shortly.
Yeah.
15 years later, guys, and they're wearing masks all through this movie.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like even like actual masks. Like Liam Neeson's got his like little whatever C95 or whatever the hell it's called.
Yeah, just wear a mask, people.
So Christopher Nolan's story begins a lot like a lot of the big directors that get talked about, guys like Spielberg and George Lucas. He's been a film fan since for as long as he could remember. So as a son of a British ad executive and an American flight attendant, Nolan, who has dual citizenship, actually, split in London and Evanston, Illinois. Gary's old stomping ground. I don't know. You live somewhere in Illinois.
Illinois is a state, so
are you familiar with Evanston? How far was that from where you were at, Gary?
I have no idea where Evanston is off the top of my head. So no. I can look it up as we talk. If you would like to dedicate the rest of this podcast to talking about Evanston,
welcome to Where Has Gary Lived podcast.
let's talk about it. No, it's close to. It looks like it's close to Chicago. It would appear it's right off Lake Michigan.
Right. Oh, okay.
So Nolan grew up obsessed with film, and he seemed destined from an early age to grow up to be a filmmaker. He loved Ridley Scott movies. He loved 2001: A Space Odyssey. He loved Star Wars. And by the age of 7, he was borrowing his father's Super 8 camera and making stop motion movies using his action figures. Nice. This is a story you hear a lot with guys like Steven Spielberg. You know, they play age to know what you're going to do with your life.
I used to make wrestling pay-per-views on a video camera with my wrestling figures. I would make like WWE pay-per-views, and currently I'm doing jack shit with that skill.
I mean, you do have a wrestling podcast. So
you just sponsored a pay-per-view, didn't you?
Yeah,
that's kind of like making one,
right?
Anyway, so fast forward a few years. After college, Nolan filmed and released his first feature called Following. That was 1998. It's a black and white film made for only about £3,000, won several awards during its festival run, and was well received by critics, and eventually gave Nolan the opportunity to make Memento 2 years later.
I feel like everybody starts off with these black and white movies. Like, they're just like, we got to come in classy.
Well, it's cheap. The film is cheaper.
Oh, okay.
Well, that's true. Yeah, mid to late 90s, black and white was still probably the least expensive way to go.
Yeah, because Aronofsky did it that way too. But
he's in good company.
And Following was one of those movies that was made over, kind of like Night of the Living Dead, over the course of months and months, mostly shooting on weekends and things like that. And you know, it's a story you hear a lot. But have you guys seen Following?
I don't think I've seen it. No.
I would recommend checking it out if you have the Criterion channel. I believe it's on there. I know that they released it on Blu-ray. It's worth checking out, especially if you're a fan of Nolan's work. Just wait
a minute. I saw this way back in the day. Yes, yeah. I did see this. I do remember this, actually.
It's really good. It's only like a little over an hour long. It's pretty solid. It's not as well formed as Memento would be a couple years later, but you can see some of the same ideas there.
I remembered it. Cool. I remembered it as I saw, like, you know, I started thinking about Memento, and I remember being blown away by Memento and trying to find whatever else this guy did. And yeah, so Following, I do remember finding it then. I would just like to announce that I was very excited. I remember being blown away by Memento and trying to find whatever else this guy did. And yeah, so Following, I do remember finding it then. I would just like to announce that I was very excited to remember that I had seen it, and I'm trying very hard this week to not hit the desk. So yes. I just like to let our listeners know I hear it too.
Yeah. We hear it.
That I constantly speak with my hands, and I'm slapping the desk. Like, I don't know. Just so, like beating my meat over here.
Please don't.
Cinema Shop. You know, the guy, the anchor, just got in trouble for that. Just got let go from CNN. Jeffrey Toobin. Did you see that?
For wanking it at the desk?
Yeah, he apparently thought he had turned his Zoom chat off. It was like in a break. They were doing like an election war games, like strategy session. And he thought he had turned his Zoom chat off. And then he just started beating. He had turned his Zoom chat off. It was like in a break. They were doing like an election war games, like strategy session. And he thought he had turned his Zoom chat off. And then he just started beating it. Like right there. And everybody just saw him started spanking it on the Zoom chat. And so anyway, he got fired. So.
Yeah, well, as he probably should have.
Yeah, you're probably right.
So Memento ended up being Nolan's breakthrough film. It kind of is the one that brought him to the wider attention of Hollywood. So impressed by his work on Memento, Steven Soderbergh recruited Nolan to direct Insomnia, which is a remake of the Norwegian film of the same name. And that movie was a success too. It did a lot of good business at the box office. It was critically well received, and it gave Nolan a lot of clout in Hollywood. The guy had done 2 fairly low budget thrillers back to back. Both were well received, but were either abandoned or things just kind of fell apart. In early 2003, he approached Warner Brothers with the idea of making a new Batman movie. So by 2003, the Batman franchise was pretty much dead. I mean, it was dead. There had been some attempts to make some other films, but Batman as a franchise was dead in the water, as was the comic book genre in general. Honestly, there had not been a successful comic book movie in quite a long time by that point. And both of those things, both the kind of failure of the Batman franchise and the comic book industry, that was all attributed to basically one movie, and that was 1997's Batman and Robin.
Yeah, that's a hard one to watch. About as hard as my bat nipples.
I think the most popular version of Batman to date at that time was without a doubt Tim Burton's Batman, released in 1989.
Right.
It was the biggest movie of 1989, and that Warner Brothers was afraid to let him make a third movie because Batman Returns was wildly successful. Normally, you want to bring the director back, but they're like, he might have gone a little too far with this one. But audiences loved it, but Warner Brothers executives were a little bit put off by it. So, for the third film in that franchise, they instead hired Joel Schumacher, director of Lost Boys, Falling Down, etc. Now, we're not going to get too far into our thoughts on Schumacher's Batman films because that's a discussion that deserves its own episode probably at some point.
Yeah.
But his second Batman film, Batman and Robin, was financially successful enough. It made less than any of its predecessors, but it did okay, but not good enough by Warner Brothers standards, and was just railroaded by critics and audiences. Like they hated it. Everyone hated it, other than like maybe young children. It is still to this day considered one of the worst superhero. Hey, I would not, if we were having a discussion on Batman and Robin, I would not be the one to just completely destroy it because I think it has its merits if you watch it as the campy movie that Schumacher was trying to make.
Right. Yeah. I
As a
think it was
representation of
related
the
back to.
character, maybe not. So
I think it blew people's minds that were watching Batman at the time, that had been watching the movies. It blew their minds as much as like 1989's Batman blew the minds of the older audience that had grown up on the old TV series probably did.
Yeah.
So.
To be honest, I mean, I alluded to this last episode last week, but I've grown to just accept that every generation has their own Batman. So that version is somebody's version.
Somebody loved it.
And yeah,
it's the same people that love the Star Wars prequels.
Yeah.
And man, those things
has their own Batman. So that version is somebody's version.
Somebody loved it.
And yeah,
it's the same people that love the Star Wars prequels.
Yeah.
And man, those things, whether we like it or not, they're going to live on.
People love them
because
I don't understand it, but people love them.
The newer generation digs it.
Yeah.
But as a result of the failure of Batman and Robin, a fifth Batman movie was scrapped by Warner Brothers because they had originally planned on bringing Schumacher back for a third film. But they scrapped those ideas after Batman and Robin. They're like, maybe not. And then Warner Brothers spent a few years pursuing the idea of rebooting the franchise, including an origin story written by Joss Whedon, which I thought was interesting that I didn't know about. When Nolan pitched his version of a Batman origin story to Warner Brothers, he pitched it as a story more grounded in reality, which is the total opposite of the kind of high camp comic book tone of Schumacher's films. And I think that's probably pitched it as a story more grounded in reality, which is the total opposite of the kind of high camp comic book tone of Schumacher's films. And I think that's probably part of what appealed to them about it, that this was like a complete 180 in tone from what Schumacher had been doing.
Because of course, once Hollywood sees that something's successful, they do 50 knockoffs of it. But the whole thing was just like, oh, it's dark and gritty. And it's like, no, watch these again. It's not dark and gritty. It's realistic. It's taken seriously.
Yeah. So after he pitched this, like Warner Brothers was sold. They liked his idea and they hired him to direct the film. Within a couple of months, David S. Goyer was brought on to write the script for it. Now, Goyer and Nolan had known each other for a while. They met around the time of Memento. They were introduced by like a mutual friend. And Goyer, of course, was a lifelong Batman fan. I think he wrote for DC for a little while. And he had already achieved some comic book movie success with the first two Blade movies. I think at the time of the development, the third Blade movie had not. He liked comic books enough to have the idea of, hey, he came to Warner Brothers with the idea of doing a Batman movie, but he wanted to bring somebody on who he knew was like an expert. So he called his friend David Goyer. That's kind of how that happened, because he knew Goyer could be the guy that he could call and ask all these questions. And at first, Goyer didn't want to do it because he was busy making Blade Trinity or writing and developing Blade Trinity, and he didn't think he had time. But at first, Nolan was like, hey, well, can I at least just call you if I have any questions? You can kind of be my consultant, and he was fine with that. Eventually, Nolan just called him and is like, you got to do this. You got to write this script.
I saw like a really cool, like little documentary thing with those guys on it. And, Nolan talks about, like you said, he had always had interest in doing a superhero movie, but like you said, he was intrigued with bringing it into reality as much as possible. What would it actually take for a man to do this thing? What would be the process? Is it even possible? That sort of thing. Goyer, like you said, is a lifelong comic book fan. Demonic Toys, Doll Man versus Demonic Toys, Puppet Master versus Demonic Toys. He did Crow City of Angels.
Remember how we always talked about how Roger Corman is connected to everything? Is Charles Band connected to everything?
I think he somewhat is, yes. And like you mentioned, he was writer for the first 2 Blade movies. He was executive producer by the time of the second. He even wrote the Nick Fury TV movie that came out with David Hasselhoff.
With David
Hasselhoff, yeah.
He produced, like you said, produced and directed Blade Trilogy. He would go on to be executive producer for like the Ghost Rider movies, the Blade TV series, the Constantine TV show. Like his comic book love is not an act. It was. And this is all just worth mentioning because I remember during this time, like Goyer was a relatively hot commodity in comic fandom.
Yeah.
Like I was a heavy reader during this time, and you never picked up an issue of Wizard without this guy's name being somewhere in it. There was hardly a comic property he didn't touch. And if you knew nothing else about Hollywood as a comic book nerd, you knew who David S. Goyer was. So I think that like that passing friendship that they had, he knew that Goyer, I think there was a conversation between the two that he knew this was his ultimate dream. Like Goyer, like when he moved to Hollywood, talks about like he told his mom, one day I'm going to work on a Batman movie. Yeah. So like, I mean, Nolan called up Goyer to talk about it, but like you said, Goyer was tied up with Blade Trinity, and he wasn't going to have time. So he's like, I can't do this. He's like, but here's my ideas for free. I've always had some ideas. If you want to tackle them, here they are. And so like Goyer did pass them off to Nolan. And of course, Nolan loved it. And as time drew near, he kept calling Goyer over and over again, kind of how you hinted at, and just said like, you have to be here for this. Don't make a mistake. And pass them off to Nolan. And of course, Nolan loved it. And as time drew near, he kept calling Goyer over and over again, kind of how you hinted at, and just said like, you have to be here for this. Don't make a mistake. And sure enough, Goyer carved out the time.
Yeah, which worked out well for him.
Yeah, and I think it's also, and I kind of alluded to this a few minutes ago, but like it's important to know that Batman and Robin was kind of the end of an era, and then this one, this and probably the first Hellboy movie really kind of started a new era of comic book movies that were being taken seriously, that were also being made with the comic book people, the quote unquote comic book people's creators, like heavily involved in the production.
Yeah.
It's because before that, it was just kind of like, all right, we'll take this idea and we'll break it down and we'll, let the movie people handle it in the production.
Yeah.
It's because before that, it was just kind of like, all right, we'll take this idea and we'll break it down and we'll, let the movie people handle it. But, this kind of was the jumping off point for this brand new, for this new approach to the comic
which we're
book.
still living in today.
Yeah, which is going strong today.
So one of those ideas that Nolan and Goyer kind of put forth was to fill in this huge gap that's typically in Batman's origin stories. Like you see him walking out of the opera or the movie theater, depending on which version I guess you're reading. Because I know there's some versions where he's watching Zorro, I think, on the screen.
Yeah, Zorro.
Yeah. But you see him walking out of the opera and his parents get killed. Then we just cut to him already in a cape and a cowl and he's Bruce Wayne. He's ready to go, or he's Batman. So Goyer said, he got to put forth the question, like, how the fuck did he get from point A to point B?
Yeah, that was the big
which is a direct quote from Goyer, by the way.
Yeah. I mean, he straight up says that was his thing. That was the big spot that he felt like.
And you see him fully formed as Jesus. You don't see when do we get Jesus Begins?
Yeah,
what's that book you gave me, Justin Lamb, that I borrowed?
Oh yeah, the Christopher Moore book that fills in the gaps. That is our Batman Begins for Jesus.
That's Jesus Begins.
That's a great book.
But no, yeah, Goyer's like, hey, everybody knows Bruce Wayne's parents gets killed. They know that he disappears and apparently got really badass, and he comes back and he starts being Batman, but nobody really ever tried to detail what was that period.
What was he
where
doing?
he disappeared.
Right. And the closest that we had come to exploring this was Frank Miller's Batman Year One. But even that begins with Bruce arriving in Gotham a few years later. He's been gone for 6 or 7 years, and he's already kind of got the idea of Batman planted in his head. So there was still like an untold story there of where he was and what he was doing and where did this idea come from.
If you look at Bruce Wayne's journey from the alleyway to the cape and cowl, there's him
He was doing and where did this idea come from?
If you look at Bruce Wayne's journey from the alleyway to the cape and cowl, there's him kind of leaving Gotham. There's him studying abroad, and then when I don't know what her name was, but anyway, when he gets back, and it's not just like, oh, and great, my Batman costume's here from Amazon. It's he takes some time to develop that.
Right.
And that's what's covered in Year One. So there was still a big chunk that was being left out.
Exactly. And so Sam Hamm, who wrote Batman 89, the screenwriter, there's a quote from him that says, you totally destroy your credibility if you show the literal process by which Bruce Wayne becomes Batman. Obviously, Nolan and Goyer disagreed with that.
Yeah.
And I think, I think that this idea of showing the development of his character, not the often touted dark, gritty take from all the other ones.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I mean, I think that's 100% right. Like it's that you get where Bruce Wayne develops his philosophy on what he's doing. Yeah. And that's an interesting take on him that nobody had ever seen, like that background.
You see Bruce Wayne become Batman. You see him get from point A to point B. In most recent Batman movies, recent at this time, like the Schumacher ones and even the Tim Burton ones, Batman was barely a character. I mean, you got some stuff with him and his love interest, etc., occasionally, but the focus of those movies was not even really Batman. He was largely a background element in films that were essentially origin stories for his villains. Those movies were always about the villains, and that's another thing that they do very clearly in this one, even more so than in the next two, is that this movie doesn't focus on the villains much. It's all about Bruce.
Yeah, I like that too. And that's one thing that absolutely stood out to me here but they're kind of already doing their thing by the time Batman shows up in this world. And so you're really getting the origin of Batman. But I think that makes it okay that for the later ones, and I'm sure we'll tackle how well it handles them, but that at least in the later ones, if you give him at least this one where it really functions to tell you the story of who this guy is, it's okay for him to you already know this guy now. So it's okay for the later ones to focus in on some villains.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and this goes as far as to Bruce doesn't even know really what he's doing when he's approached by Ducard in the prison cell, and Ducard says, "You may find what you were looking for." And he goes, "Well, what am I looking for?" He's like, "Only you know that." And even when he gets to the temple, he's struggling to find the words. He's just kind of like, "I'm seeking," and then he spurts it out, and that's kind of okay. The ball's rolling now.
Yeah,
so, I mean, this is literally the beginning of Batman.
He's discovering his. So for Nolan, the
relates back to
off,
the top of the podcast.
So for Nolan, the jumping off point of inspiration was a short story called "The Man Who Falls," written by Denny O'Neil and Dick Giordano. Have you read this one, Todd? I was not familiar with this one before looking into this.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with this one either. However, I have read a shit ton of Denny O'Neil and Dick Giordano's.
So this one kind of
their stuff is kind of seminal on the character.
Well, it kind of explores Bruce's travels throughout the world, and an early scene in Batman Begins where Bruce falls into the well is actually taken from this story.
Nice.
So for Goyer, Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale's The Long Halloween served as a major inspiration with Carmine Falcone as the villain, and also he said Goyer also said he took inspiration from that story, with Carmine Falcone as the villain, and also he said Goyer also said he took inspiration from that story because of its more somber, serious approach.
Long Halloween is very, not to, spend a lot of time here, but just it's, first of all, if you've never read it, it's amazing because it actually shows Batman as a detective.
Yeah.
And the stuff that happens in there to some of the characters is pretty heavy. So yeah, it's definitely worth reading and getting a nice
It's
copy
funny
for
you say
yourself.
that because we're going to have to get into this later as we discuss the movie itself. But that's interesting about that because I thought the same exact thing, and I have some stuff to say about it. But I will say that Jeff Loeb, Tim Sale stuff, for anybody not familiar,
Yeah, I'm a fan with all of their stuff.
I think I've got them all like a hardback, like graphic novel form. Haunted Night, Long Halloween, Dark Victory. He does Superman for All Seasons. They sell stuff for anybody not familiar.
Yeah, I'm a fan with all of their stuff.
I think I've got them all like a hardback, like graphic novel form. Haunted Night, Long Halloween, Dark Victory. He does Superman for All Seasons. They do some Cap, Spidey, Hulk, Daredevil stuff. It's just good stories and like great art.
They do like Daredevil Yellow and Hulk Gray and all that, right?
Yeah,
Right.
what
And
are- what are
Spidey
referred to as the
Blue,
Marvel color
Spider-Man
books.
Blue, and Cap White.
Yeah.
The really cool part to me about this whole story, though, is like what ended up happening is that like Nolan and Goyer hung out every day in like Nolan's garage as Goyer was available. They would hang out and just shoot the shit. They literally took walks each day to the old Bat Cave from the TV show, which was right down from like Christopher Nolan's place. And
That's funny.
Yeah, and another funny
I
story.
wish I could just take walks to the old Bat Cave from the TV show.
Yeah, they would go and just like hang out there. And a funny story Goyer tells from the time is that when he realized he was a regular at the comic shop, and so like his people at the comic book shop knew who he was, and so they're like, "Why are you buying all this Batman shit, man? Like, what's going on?" He's like, "Okay, I'm just feeling Batman right now. Like, I just want to read it." They're like, "You're working on Batman, aren't you?" And he's like, "No, I'm just like." I'm interested in Batman. Like he couldn't talk about it.
Yeah.
And they would like ask him every day. And then like when it blew up that he was working on Batman, they were like, "You son of a bitch, I knew it. I
You
knew
lied
it."
to us.
And, but he said he realized like how big it got really though when he was talking to Nolan, and they would go to this diner all the time. Like they would go sit in this diner and would hash out stuff. He said he remembered Christopher Nolan would always order an omelet with avocado, a side of bacon, and cream cheese. And yes, that is the kind of detail you will only get on this podcast. They were like on the internet one night, and somebody had snapped a picture of them sitting in the diner. And they're like, "There's Christopher Nolan and diner," and wait for them to show up. Try to walk past the table and take a photo of their notes on the table. He said, it's just nuts.
The internet, man.
But what's crazy too, like I loved about this, sorry to keep rambling on, but like they said that, like during this time, like Nolan's like, I had to call in my buddy, Nathan Crawley, production designer. He's like, he brings him into the garage and they start sketching out Gotham, the suit, other ideas. They're literally had Nathan Crowley start building Gotham City right in Christopher Nolan's garage.
Oh, that's awesome.
Like Blade Runner was a huge inspiration. They watched Blade Runner, like got that down for like how the city would look and like some ideas. And they said like as Goyer and Nolan are tossing out ideas, Nathan would jump in and be like, "Hey, I hear what you're saying, but what if Bruce Wayne did this thing?" And so they're like, "All right, join the circle." So then, like he said, Nolan describes this as like one of the most fun times he's ever had making a movie. It's like him and David Goyer and Nathan Crawley like hanging out in his garage, like just shooting the shit and tossing ideas and building on them with each other. They started like passing stuff back and forth to the studio under, I think the title at the time was The Intimidation Game.
Yeah,
was what they used, and eventually when they were ready, like WB actually had to come take a meeting in Nolan's garage to see and hear the final pitch for what they were doing.
That's great.
Well, hell, they were so secretive with the script. It was like you either got a 20-minute phone call with Chris Nolan or you sat in the garage. And he
for Michael Caine tells a story where he gets a knock on the door one day, and he's home alone. I don't think he has a butler or anything, but he's there. So he answers the door himself, and Christopher Nolan is at his door. Christopher Nolan's standing. He's there. So he answers the door himself, and Christopher Nolan is at his door. Christopher Nolan's standing there.
Nice.
And he's like, he's like, "Can you read something for me?" And Michael Caine, who knew who Christopher Nolan was because he knew Insomnia and Memento, he was like, "Okay." He's like, "Yeah, just leave it. I'll read it." And Christopher Nolan's like, "No, you gotta, like, I'm going to stay here while you read it. And then I'm going to take the script with me when you're done." And Michael Caine thought, it was going to be another one of his small little thrillers like he had done before. So he spends like half an hour reading the script, and he's like, he starts reading it, and he realizes this is a Batman movie, which is totally not what he was expecting it to be.
Awesome.
Yes. And I think he signed up or at least handshake deal was made there on the spot, that he loved it and wanted to be part of it.
It's freaking awesome.
Yeah. We'll get to Michael Caine more.
Well, yeah. I mean, I guess this is a good time to talk about the casting of the film. So you've got he, of course, was a child actor from, Newsies and Empire of the Sun, but wasn't like a mainstream guy. Like American Psycho had already been made, but as we know, American Psycho was not like a hit upon release. It became a cult classic later on. I remember seeing Christian Bale in a movie in 2002, so not long before this, called Equilibrium. And that movie, first of all, if you haven't seen it, it is a badass movie.
Yeah, it's really awesome.
It is really awesome. And now this could be my memory playing tricks with me, but I remember in my mind thinking when I saw that movie, this guy would be a fucking good Batman. Yeah.
Because I don't think you're lying about that, Justin, because I literally was thinking about this as I watched the movie, and I was like, what was it? I remember being excited, and it was that. So like American Psycho had happened, like you said. I remembered having seen this. Like, what was it? I remember being excited, and it was that. So like American Psycho had happened, like you said. I remembered having seen the guy in Reign of Fire.
Reign of Fire was around the same time.
Yep.
Yeah, and
which is also a badass movie if you haven't seen it, that gets not enough love.
Yeah.
Right. And I guess Patrick Bateman's probably the most closely connected as far as being a narcissistic rich guy. So he kind of had that part. But I do remember the big movie that people would point me to. And I swear, like this was early in our friendship too. I remember you pointing me to like Equilibrium, I feel like. Yeah. And I feel like that movie demonstrates the gun kata that they do. I just remember being excited about this movie because I was like, I think as a comic nerd, you're just interested in having a Batman who actually looks like he could whip someone's ass. Christian Bale had that.
Yeah, I mean, they showcase. It's like, those two things combined. You're like, yeah, how is this guy not Batman?
Right, because you kind of see the Batman side of him in Equilibrium and the possible Bruce Wayne side of him in American Psycho. Yeah. So that 1-2 kind of goes like in your brain, this guy's Batman.
Well, what's funny about that is you say that, and I remember seeing and some stuff. Nolan's biggest concern was that he said that he had plenty of guys who could be Bruce Wayne, and he had other guys who could be Batman.
Yep. Right.
But you wanted a guy who you could believe as both.
Find you a man who can do both.
Yeah, exactly. Nolan's idea was that Bruce Wayne in this movie is getting just as much time as Bats. So you need an actor. Yeah, or more. And so you need an actor that can keep the audience engaged, and they're not just marking time until the next time the cape and cowl come out.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I said that for years of just like all these guys. I said that for years of just like all these guys who are, who get the opportunity. It's like they don't change at all once they put the mask on. And I was just like, they just don't get it.
Yeah.
Well, for Nolan, what the biggest thing was with Bale was he thought that Bale had the eyes. I saw that about him. Like he said that Nolan loved Bale's intensity and the look he'd have. He thought it felt like you could really believe this was a guy who became unhinged enough that he would take it this far. Yeah.
Well, and Bale had shown interest in the role dating all the way back to Darren Aronofsky's development of a Year One film, and also Wolfgang Peterson was developing a Batman versus Superman for a while, and Bale was showing interest in both of those projects. So he had wanted to be Batman for a while. And a couple of other actors who had been considered either by Nolan or by the studio were Henry Cavill, actually was one. Nice. Billy Crudup, Jake Gyllenhaal got pretty close to getting this role. Joshua Jackson, David Boreanaz, who I think is a pretty interesting.
That is interesting.
Because Angel is kind of very Batman-esque.
I'm curious if that relates back to the Joss Whedon initial involvement or something.
It's possible, yeah. Cillian Murphy, actually. Do you say Cillian or Cillian?
I say Cillian, but
All right,
I don't
we'll
know
say-
what's
I've been
correct.
saying Killian.
I don't know
Cillian's a
what's
beer,
right.
but
Yeah.
with a K. I don't know. Anyway, Mr. Murphy was considered, and Heath Ledger actually was in consideration.
Well, glad he didn't get that because he nailed it the next time around.
Yeah. And so another really cool Christian Bale movie that had just recently come out was one called The Machinist. I don't know if you guys have seen it. It's a great movie.
I've
Yeah.
seen it. Yeah.
And
wild.
he lost a ton of weight because he plays this emaciated guy who with insomnia, and he looks horrible in it. Like, in fact, when Warner Brothers like met with Christian Bale,
Do not body shame Christian.
see his spine like through his shirt, and they're like, "How is this guy going to be Batman?" But Nolan convinced him, and Bale hired a personal trainer to help him gain weight, and he gained 100 pounds of muscle.
And then
Now,
his trainer
granted,
was
he-
like, "Good for you."
He was probably like 40 pounds underweight, but he gained 100 pounds of muscle in the span of only a couple of months, would actually put him about 30 pounds over where he needed to be, and he wouldn't fit in the bat suit. So he had to go back and lose some of the weight before filming began. Then to prepare for the fight scenes, he actually trained in Wing Chun.
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning a guy here that's really important is a dude named David Foreman, who's the fight arranger on this movie. And he's all over the place. This is a guy who's doing stunts and fighting from he's in like 2 to 3 movies a year. You will find this freaking guy.
Ninja Turtles.
He was in Ninja Turtles. He's Leonardo, to James Bond, to Star Wars, to handling Game of Thrones. He actually got handed a big movies a year. You will find this freaking guy.
Ninja Turtles.
He was in Ninja Turtles. He's Leonardo, to James Bond, to Star Wars, to handling Game of Thrones. He actually got handed a big opportunity here and worked closely with Nolan on this stuff. So like what Justin was saying, when Nolan walked in and they saw Bale, I think the last meeting Nolan and Bale had was during The Machinist, and Nolan had impressed on him, like, look, man, we can't sell you like this. Like, you gotta get as big as you can, because if I'm gonna pitch this to WB, and I want you to be the man, but you got to get as big as possible. Well, we know Christian Bale is obviously a fan of body transformation, and nobody takes him seriously when it comes to this. And he went from his lowest in The Machinist, which was 110 to 120, depending on where you read. And he walked back in to meet with these guys at 220. And, and so Christian Bale's a 6 foot tall guy, even, which was 110 to 120, depending on where you read. And he walked back in to meet with these guys at 220. And, and so Christian Bale's a 6 foot tall guy, even, and he normally sits at like 180.
Yeah.
When he walked in, Nolan was like, "Oh, holy shit!" And he asked these guys, and Foreman said, "I don't know if I can work with it. He's just a big fucking bear now."
Yeah.
I wonder if there are any pictures of him from that time where he was just enormous. Like,
It's funny because watching this again, and I watched it twice this week in addition to like all the special features that are on the Blu-ray. But if you look at some of the training sequences when he's at Ra's al Ghul's temple, and then at the sequence of him doing push-ups in the bedroom, you can see the two different body type. Like when he's starting his training, he's bigger
that I most connect with.
Right. No, I connect with the fighter when he's a crackhead.
What about like American Hustle or whatever, where he just had a beer belly?
That's me. That's me. So Justin, you take Cheney, and then Gary, you've got yours, and I'll take.
I'll just be a different Chris Nolan or Christian Bale. I mean, no. What I love about it is like Nolan had to sit down and say, "Okay, look, I'm sorry, but this is too much." Like when I said get as big as possible, I did not know.
I did not mean literally.
Yeah. Well, I think famously he said, "We're making Batman, not Fat Man."
Yeah, that was a tale that Christian Bale says. It's like people in the crew were like, "Are we making Batman or Fat Man? Come on, dude."
Yeah.
and he said, "You got to lean up." Hey, Nolan tells the story that like usually when you tell an actor to lose or gain weight, they're like, "Oh yeah, tell the word to do." And Bale would be like, "I'm going to get it to here. I will be this many inches here. This is like my size." And Nolan went to the wardrobe department and said, especially because they're molding a suit here. Yeah, he said, "Okay, he is going to be this size and take this literally. Like, like this is the size he will be. And he said he came down to the wire, but Christian Bale came in and was like, that I'm this size.
It works. Yeah. It works.
And one of the big reasons,
kudos, because he fucking kills it.
Well, one of the big things you see in like stuff is like depictions of Batman. Sometimes he does look like a big bear, but
I mean, look at Frank Miller's Dark Knight.
Yeah, exactly. But for Foreman and these guys, I mean, a big part of this was the fighting, and Batman's going to need stamina more than size. That was like one of Foreman's concerns, I remember. And the suit, the martial
It's not
arts,
the size; it's the motion in the ocean.
Right. Justin mentioned Wing Chun, but one of the big things they tackled was if Batman is doing what he's doing, everybody's seen karate, they've seen kung fu. We need something different. And so that's why they went out and they found this Casey fighting method.
Casey fighting method.
Casey, I apologize. Yeah, it is Casey. Casey fighting method, which was founded by Justo Dieguez and Andy Norman. I think that's their names. They also brought them in to work on this film. At the time, this was pretty unknown. I think they used it in like Mission Impossible 3.
It's a very young style, but it's slowly gaining some traction.
Yeah, now it's becoming more and more common. This is Jack Reacher. This is what Daniel Craig uses in James Bond, etc. Bale liked it too because it's about being reactionary and using whatever's there at the moment, just whatever feels right. Like in his detail for the character, it was about being aggressive. Like Bale liked it too because it's about being reactionary and using whatever's there at the moment, just whatever feels right. Like in his detail for the character, it was about being aggressive. Like when you put on that suit, you become an animal. You are just a monster. You're just like battling with whatever's there, just attacking however. In
my brief, well, I've been doing involved in martial arts for a little while, but in my experience, I've never seen a style so clean, meaning there's no wasted movement with KC with KFM, and it is as equally brutal as it is clean. And it's really fascinating to watch because I feel like it just hasn't really gotten its fair exhibition in a movie. Like it's been used here and like you said, Mission Impossible 3, and I think a couple other places, but hasn't really gotten its fair exhibition in a movie. Like it's been used here and like you said, Mission Impossible 3, and I think a couple other places, but it just really hasn't gotten the big solid push in popular culture.
But they describe that as being part of what they think is fun about it. Like it's a currently evolving martial art. You know, people wouldn't be as familiar with having seen something like it. It's a very close quartered style martial art from my understanding. And so the biggest challenge is that you do have to be more expressive on screen, not theatrical, but like more expressive so they can get the shots and that thing. But all of them, one of the cool things I thought was really interesting is that all of them describe being disgusted by Christian Bale because apparently Christian Bale has a photographic memory. And so they would say like, we'll show him 20 moves and in a half.
For being said about him on Equilibrium was that because he was a trained dancer, he was able to pick the martial arts stuff up pretty quickly.
They say they would like block out the fights and like they would spend forever like blocking out what do these fights look like, how's this go, and he would just be like, can I get a tape of that? And they would have taped it and he would take it home. He'd come back the next morning and he knew it exactly. They literally say they have like 18 hours of footage of Christian Bale fighting, and like he just was just so good, and they would keep training with him. Each time they'd like correct him on something, immediately he had the next thing. And they're saying like what's even crazier is like this is not like easy fights, like not like just these are thought out processes. There's a focus on him knowing each area he's supposed to be targeting in this scene and why he's hitting where. They like know like what bones, like part of that Casey fighting method is to be a thing about Bruce Wayne having courage. So there was a focus on they wanted multiple opponents at once and not attacking one at a time. They wanted like everybody piling on. I mean, this is like the Ra's al Ghul line is like, you've trained, you can fight 6 opponents. We're going to train you to fight 600. And like they wanted that to be a thing, that there's like courage involved in this person. These are big fights. And then Christian Bale is like, no, I'm learning all this. I'm doing every single one. And they're like, no, we got stuck, guys. And he's like, no, I'm doing them. Like, and they're like, now we have to also worry about you don't fucking get injured in the middle of the match because we're like swinging at you.
Right.
Like,
So Nolan's template for casting the rest of the film was actually Richard Donner's Superman, 1978. Donner, what he did is he surrounded his star, who was relatively unknown at the time as well, with a bunch of great, well-known character actors. Guys like Marlon Brando. Guys like Marlon Brando, Gene Hackman, Ned Beatty. So they cast Batman Begins similarly. They cast, you've got Katie Holmes, who was well-known, Rutger Hauer, Morgan Freeman, Michael Caine, Tom Wilkinson. They basically surrounded Bale with a cast of very well-known, very well-respected actors, which also helps to lend sort of credibility to their comic book movie, which comic book movies in the past, I mean, obviously there are some big names in the Burton Schumacher series, but a lot of that was almost stunt casting,
Right.
Whereas here it's like, they're not the stars of the movie. None of them are the stars of the movie. The stars of the movie, I mean, obviously Christian Bale and Cillian Murphy, I guess, Liam Neeson, but a lot of these are even bigger names than them, and they're small supporting roles. I mean, Rutger Hauer's got 4 minutes of screen time, and Rutger Hauer's, but a lot of these are even bigger names than them, and they're small supporting roles. I mean, Rutger Hauer's got 4 minutes of screen time, and Rutger Hauer's a very well-known actor.
I was so happy to see him, and he has very little to do, but no, Justin, you bring up an interesting point, because I mean, this is a thing I saw with Nolan as I was like looking into Nolan a little bit more, and I can't wait till we actually just dive into Nolan in general someday. He seems to have an emphasis, like I've seen this in multiple places, the importance of really working on all of the supporting characters being of great importance, because even if they're only on the screen for just a little bit, they are what actually makes the world real and believable. Like that
absolutely.
These characters already feel like they are part of some existing environment that's already happened, and they carry it so perfectly. And part of some existing environment that's already happened, and they carry it so perfectly. And it seems like a thing that, like, saying it out loud, I'm like, oh, that should just be like common knowledge, but I don't know that it is. Like, I don't know
that that's the case with a lot of directors.
Just go pull up the resumes, listeners, go pull up the resumes of the cast of Batman Begins prior to 2005. There's no bad actors on that list.
Yeah.
They've all put in the time and put in the work. And I think it's clear that Chris Nolan sold them on not the fact that it's this big comic book thing. He sold it to them that it's an exploration of this character.
Yes.
And they all want to be in those meaty, juicy movies that really explore. I mean, this one clearly explores the psyche of a very damaged man.
Yes.
And what it really takes to do the things like, hey, these are solid roles. Oh, and by the way, it's going to be one of the biggest movies ever because it's X.
Yeah.
Because it's a big poppy franchise. How do you not say no? You can't say no to that.
Yeah. I mean, Cillian Murphy's probably the least known in this.
Yeah.
But he's just a great actor. And he had, we mentioned he had auditioned for Bruce Wayne. When Nolan didn't cast him, he asked him to play Scarecrow, which I think was a great choice.
Mm-hmm.
But Liam Neeson, of course, as Ra's al Ghul. Gary Oldman was actually the first choice for that role, but of course we ended up playing
for Raish.
Yeah.
Nice.
Well, I'm saying Ra's because that's how they say it in the movie.
I say Raish because that's how Dan Didio and Denny O'Neil, the guys who created the character.
Well, I remember
I call him Raish.
And John Gilstrap. No, that means nothing to anybody else.
That
Always
means
used to say
nothing to
Raish, and I was like, "What the fuck?" Like,
that's right. Yeah.
Where does that come from?
I remember I call him Raish.
And John Gilstrap. No, that means nothing to anybody else.
That
Always
means
used to say
anybody.
Raish, and I was like, "What the fuck?" Like,
That's right. Yeah.
Where does that come from?
Guy Pearce, who starred in Nolan's Memento, said in interviews that him and Nolan spoke about the possibility of him playing the role, but they both kind of decided that he was just too young to play that.
For race.
Yeah,
I think the fun part here is for Roz. I think the fun part is that this is as dark as anybody will remember ever seeing Liam Neeson. He's always very stoic and monk-like in every role, and at least up until this point, especially.
Well, that's one of the reasons they thought it was kind of fun to cast him in the roles, because he had kind of been known as, he plays a lot of like mentor types prior to this. I would say, I would not necessarily say this is the darkest you've ever seen him, because Darkman.
Sure.
Not just because of the name, but that's a pretty
big roles. Like, I love Darkman, but
right.
But he was kind of known as playing like these mentor roles, so they thought it would be a really good way to pull the rug out from under the audience when he turns out to be the villain at the end, when he starts out as that mentor, you know.
Yeah, when he really gets to turn and show the dark side of an idealist. Like the ideologue, like what he's doing is the best way. And yeah, I don't know. It was like he gets to do like a twist to like that role.
Well, it was something that struck me, like, as I was watching the special features and they would interview Liam Neeson and he comes in with that voice and I was just like, oh, he's still in character. And then I remember it was like, oh, wait, no, that's just how he talks.
Yeah. And that's just his voice.
But it's one of those voices that just draws you in, and he has this very fatherly, mentor teacher type thing where you just hang on every word. And he's like, oh, and we're just hang on every word. And he's like, oh, and we're going to sink all the countries and, destroy all the banks. And we're going to, level the city. And you're just like,
speaking of voices, can we talk about how great all of the British and Irish actors are in this movie at doing American accents?
Yeah, really solid.
Because the cast is filled with them. You've got, of course, Christian Bale. You've got Cillian Murphy. You've got Tom Wilkinson doing a great accent, and of course Gary Oldman. Like, they're all doing really excellent American accents.
Well, speaking of which, I think especially I noticed it in the special features, but I remembered that all the press that Christian Bale did, he kept the voice up.
That's what he does.
Yeah, he stayed in it. Which when people looked him up and saw that he's British, they're like, "What?" But no, it was great to see that attention to detail.
Well, Gary Oldman was not the like we said, he was originally kind of considered for Ra's al Ghul. Is that what we're saying? Raish.
Yeah,
nobody's saying that except Todd.
Ra's al Ghul. Chris Cooper, you might know from adaptation American Beauty. Chris Cooper was originally offered the part of Jim Gordon, but when he turned it down because he wanted to spend more time with his family. So Nolan thought it would be kind of cool and kind of refreshing for Oldman, who was known, especially at the time, for his portrayal of villains, to play the role instead, the role of probably the best dude in the movie, like the only person, and I'm including Batman in this.
Yeah.
One of the only people who's a genuinely good person. Him and Rachel are probably the only genuinely good people in the movie.
Yeah. That's 100%
maybe
true.
Thomas.
And gotta love Oldman, because you've never seen him more wholesome than
so
he
great.
is.
He's so great. And it's they kind of
fucking just lives in the character he's possessing, and he is literally becoming Jim Gordon from Batman Year One.
Yeah.
And what's funny about this too is he's so much more, I don't know if tepid's the right word, but he's so much more like just low key than he normally is as an actor. And I read some that becomes that happened by accident. He had been learning the lines for this role, like in his kitchen at home, and then on the plane on the way to the filming. And so he was like trying to learn them quieter. And then he got there and he was just not thinking about it. And then the first scene that he like was with Nolan, he was playing quiet. And then Nolan's like, "Oh yeah, that's perfect. Do that." And he's like, "Oh, well, all right."
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that, but it's kind of,
he was playing quiet. And then Nolan's like, "Oh yeah, that's perfect. Do that." And he's like, "Oh, well, all right."
Well, It's funny that you mentioned that, but it's kind of perfect for that character, especially looking at year one, where I mean, we just mentioned that his look is directly taken out of year one. But Jim Gordon is one of those characters that he's a detective. He's a Chicago detective. He's been around
Gotham.
Initially he comes from Chicago to Gotham. But
does Chicago exist in the DC universe?
Yeah.
And with Metropolis and Gotham.
Yeah,
and
it's weird. Yeah, the DC landscape is very oddly laid out. But anyways, he comes from Chicago, so he's kind of the new kid in town, but he's got some years under his belt, and then he's the type that sits back and observes and really pays attention to what's going on. This is where he's
I just watched John Carpenter's Vampires, and the wife was immediately like, I had pointed him out in that movie, and I was like, that's a great character actor. And she's like,
funny. Well, he's in Memento. He's the guy.
Yeah, he's the guy at the hotel.
Yeah, he manages the hotel. But yeah, he's watching all this stuff happen. So for him to play it quiet is actually a perfect approach.
Yeah. So as he has with all of his films, and this is something I didn't know about Nolan.
Wait, can I just say, Justin, I don't mean to cut you off, but
okay.
you stepped right over Michael Caine and Morgan Freeman. And
I mean, I didn't have any good stories about their casting other than the Michael Caine story that I already told.
I just love that they are legitimately two of my favorite characters in this movie. Like, I think that, I mean, and you're right. I mean, I don't know like any great stories from it, except for that, like Michael Caine talks about Alfred was based on his like uncle who was an SAS officer. And that was one of the big things with Nolan was they talk badass character. Like he has a past too that we're not going to delve into right now, but he did say in one interview I read, he was just like, I'm just waiting for Alfred year one. And,
they tried to do that as a TV show, didn't they?
Yeah,
they did. Yeah,
but they're brilliant as friend/mentor.
Well,
figures.
they also, I think, both of them also get the lion's share of the humor in the movie because they both get the funny lines, and this movie was way funnier than I remembered it being. Because Christopher Nolan, I like Christopher Nolan as a director, but he is not known for his sense of humor, and many of his films don't have much of a sense of humor at all. But this one was actually, especially with those two, with Lucius Fox and Alfred, they're very funny, especially the stuff with Lucius and Bruce talking, where Bruce is and many of his films don't have much of a sense of humor at all. But this one was actually, especially with those two, with Lucius Fox and Alfred, they're very funny, especially the stuff with Lucius and Bruce talking, where Bruce is asking him all these questions about, the Tumblr and things like that. And he's basically telling him that he's going to be Batman without coming out and saying that he's going to be Batman, and because the audience knows what he's doing, it's really funny. And Morgan Freeman has this great delivery in a lot of his movies, but it works really well here, where it's kind of it's very like there's a lot of gravitas to it because of his voice, but also there's this kind of impish, like mischievousness behind it, and I think that works really well because of those scenes, and it works really well later. Like there's a lot of gravitas to it because of his voice, but also there's this kind of impish, like mischievousness behind it, and I think that works really well because of those scenes, and it works really well later when he gets rehired by Bruce at the end.
Oh, it's brilliant there, but no, I'm so glad you brought that up, because it reminded me of, like, I was reading back on, God bless them, chud.com. Like back in the day, I was reading some stuff on there, and they had an interview with Morgan Freeman, and he gets asked like how do you approach a character like this? Like maybe this is a little different than what you're used to, and blah blah blah. And like how do you make it feel real? And Morgan Freeman like is very much like got forgive me, I don't have a Morgan Freeman impersonation. Just like, well, how do you make it real? You know what the hell you're talking about? Like he's like, I read the science, I looked it up, I studied it. Walks in, he's like, you don't sound good as a scientist that's been studying shit forever if you're like, Well, the reason the chemical functions this way is because I think that it. He's like, no, you know what the fuck it's doing, and he's like, I knew what I was talking about. Like
Oh,
in
that's
each
great.
scene, he
Yeah,
was
'cause
like,
he's
that's
got
how
a
it was
couple-
real.
He's got a couple tricky lines and just nails them.
Yeah.
Yeah. You'd never question that he's doesn't work in applied sciences.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
So as he has with all of his films, Nolan refused to have a second unit on this movie. According to Wally Pfister, the cinematographer on this, who is also a legend, by the way, if you look up his filmography.
With good reason.
According to him,
beautiful movie.
yeah. According to him, Nolan told the studio, why would I want to direct an action film where I hire another director to direct the action? Because that's what normally happens as a second unit director does all the action stuff. He wanted to do action where they're all over the place, and he travels all over the world to get this shit. The crew built a village and the front doors to Roz's temple there in Iceland. As you can imagine, shooting on a glacier, the weather was an issue. They had 75-mile-per-hour winds. They had heavy rains, and they didn't have any snow some of the time when they needed snow. They also, there was the fight on the ice where they're training, where Bruce and Roz are training, or Ducard, I guess at that point, are training on the ice having the sword fight.
Yeah.
So they're filming that scene, and they hear a crack in the ice.
Yeah.
And the crew's like, no, get off. And they like have to rush to get off the ice. And they ended up going back on. They finished filming. They filmed that all that day. The next day, the lake was water. The ice was gone.
Yeah.
So I imagine the alternate history version of that, where both Christian Bale and Liam Neeson fall into freezing water below some ice. Because that very well could have happened. It's
Keep the curtain drawn, Gary.
No.
We let people
but I was
have a
talking
peek
with
behind the
I was
curtain.
talking with Gary about it during a break, and said this you can't get this on a soundstage. You can't.
Yeah.
And
you don't get
it's
that
so
sense of scope.
yes, huge scope on this, and it's so beautiful that I mean, and my wife has seen these a bunch of times too, but even as she's walking, by the couch, I caught her a couple times, just she stops and she's drawn in immediately because Wally just knocked it out of the park.
Yeah.
It's such a beautiful movie that even if you're not a Batman fan, you can't help but be drawn in. Some of those shots made it into the trailer, and I have a feeling that some people sat there in the theater, and once they saw this, they're like, oh, what is this? And then when it's revealed to be a Batman movie, they're like, what? I mean, because it doesn't look like anything else, because you can't get something like this with that ice fight scene and with that glacier on the mountains.
It feels different than if they
even if you're not a Batman fan, you can't help but be drawn in. Some of those shots made it into the trailer, and I have a feeling that some people sat there in the theater, and once they saw this, they're like, oh, what is this? And then when it's revealed to be a Batman movie, they're like, what? I mean, because it doesn't look like anything else, because you can't get something like this with that ice fight scene and with that glacier on the mountains.
It feels different than if they'd shot that like on a green screen.
Yeah.
I mean,
They
I told
did.
Todd like that has to come up, because I mean, that is 100% something that stood out to me this time watching it through. I was telling him, like, I saw this movie in the theaters. I've seen it more than once, but I literally have probably not seen this movie in at least 5 years. I guarantee you I haven't seen it in at least 5 years. And watching it this time, it fucking blew me away just how beautiful these shots were.
Yeah.
Like, it's just some amazing shots. And yes, that Iceland stuff especially just blew me away just how beautiful these shots were.
Yeah.
Like, it's just some amazing shots. And yes, that Iceland stuff especially just fantastic. Just cinematography there.
And some of the stuff that we talked about during the Romero Savini series about special effects, some special effects enhancing the shots as opposed to special effects being the shots.
Yes.
And I think that was the use of digital was so well done here, because
there are very few digital
few
shots in this. Yeah.
And
Very few for a film of this size.
Yeah. And every shot that's in there really just amps up what's already on film. And
we'll get into
really
it.
great.
Yeah, like the bats, I think it feels like are probably like the most digital thing that happens in this movie.
But they don't even look at, honestly, the way that they're pulled off.
No, and we, I mean, like I read a whole thing about this, but like the bats, and I'm like, those look amazing. Like, you guys did so good. And they're like, no, those are real bats and they're sleeping. Don't wake them up. But he's like, oh shit. And, but yeah, a lot of the time they found that they wouldn't cooperate. So not spend forever on this, but I mean, there is some real science that went into this fucking movie that people, that at the time was breaking ground, like them 3D mapping using like they were using like some military stuff, like especially the stuff in like where Bruce calls in the bats, that like in those hallways they mapped the area, then they 3D enhanced like bats like in the area, but because of the 3D mapping they could like bounce them off the walls and like
to act as they would in a hallway. Yeah.
So years in London, New York, and Chicago. For some reason, I always thought that he was mostly shooting in Chicago because I guess that's where like the car chase is in Chicago, and that's what I knew. But I
also thought that was super strange. I always heard Chicago. I also like in some stuff I read like some stuff in Hong Kong. Nolan.
Well, they didn't shoot in Hong Kong. I'll get to that in a second.
Well, I just mean as a frame of reference for like what this city looks like.
Yeah. So the reason he used multiple locations is to keep the city from being recognizable. Because at no point do you look at it and you go, "That's Chicago, that's New York, that's London." Which, of course, that's a pretty major departure. The way he shoots Gotham is a pretty major departure from Schumacher and Burton's films, where Gotham doesn't exist in the real world. Like, it doesn't look real. This looks like a real city, but not a recognizable city.
Mm-hmm.
So for a lot of the interiors, Nolan shot most of the production in England. Doesn't exist in the real world. Like, it doesn't look real. This looks like a real city, but not a recognizable city.
Mm-hmm.
So for a lot of the interiors, Nolan shot most of the production in England's Shepperton Studios, which is also where Superman 78 shot a lot of stuff. James Bond shoots a lot at Shepperton. So you mentioned earlier, Gary, that Nolan and Nathan Crowley, the production designer, they looked at Blade Runner for inspiration. I think Nolan actually made them watch the movie. They also, they drew elements from New York, Chicago, Tokyo, but the Narrows is specifically based on a section of Hong Kong that does not exist. It's been demolished. There's a walled city called Kowloon in Hong Kong. So I have to admit, I was not familiar with what Kowloon is. And the Narrows has a very like specific look to it. So I went down this kind of rabbit hole when I found out that like a walled city inside of Hong Kong, like what is this? And after the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong during World War II, its population increased dramatically. And by 1990, this walled city, which only measures about 6.5 acres, so it's not very big, contained 50,000 residents.
Holy shit.
So people are just like living.
You sound like you're from Kowloon Bay as opposed to Hong Kong. I was born in Kowloon Bay. That's from Wayne's World.
Is that what that is?
That is. I don't know how in our notes that we share, I missed this whole paragraph. I apologize, Justin. I don't know. I skipped it. Apparently, all times I read this through, but because I would have had that Wayne's World quote more accurate and prepared. But I think that's pretty dead on. Like,
Yeah, so it's pretty wild though. I mean, imagine 50,000 people in 6.5 acres. From the 1950s to the 1970s, it was controlled by the 50,000 people in 6.5 acres. From the 1950s to the 1970s, it was controlled by the triads, and it had high rates of prostitution, gambling, drug abuse. Like, it was a rough place. So that's visually and conceptually kind of what the Narrows kind of represents. It was actually demolished in 1993, 1994, and now there's like a park there, the Kowloon Memorial Park. So there are like parts of it they preserved, but it's like this pretty little area of Hong Kong now. But what a wild history that place.
Yeah, it sounds like those. It sounds like that area in Brazil where they shot a lot of Incredible Hulk.
Yes. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, those are the favelas, which are a little bit. That's a bigger area, but yes,
it's more widespread, but just people on top of people.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think the trick is that Nolan. One term I heard him repeatedly in interviews, or saw him say in interviews. previously we talked about like him talking about like the realism of this situation. He was talking about heightened reality. Like that's eventually where he landed. And that was like the term he used over and over again in some stuff I read was heightened reality. Like he wanted it to be this reality, but like, how do we take it to the next level? Or it's like, you can feel it. It feels a little further along, but
yeah.
Anyway, you get the idea from the term. So he took these like templates from different places and like tried to combine them into something. But one thing I thought was really cool is that, yeah, Chicago was a huge one because I don't think this was done very often, but like, you know, in those garage sessions I mentioned early on, they had sketched out what they thought Gotham City would look like. And then they took, especially from Chicago, like 3D mapping and images from like tried to overlay to fit the images of Gotham City. Like, so it's not all just like computer generated design. It's like, what pieces of these cities can we use in this already 3D map city that we can design? And I'll probably fuck it up because I'm not as intelligent as this, but it was like they overlaid those on top of like the idea of what this would look like.
Yeah.
And so it made a believable, real city that like existed. And it was pretty impressive. And I think that would be the thing he would take on to things like and prove that it could happen, like especially in like something like Inception or something later on.
Yeah.
I remember one of the biggest surprises people got when this movie was about to come out was the reveal of this universe's Batmobile, which they nicknamed the Tumbler.
Right.
Lucius calls it, I believe. Was the reveal of this universe's Batmobile, which they nicknamed the Tumbler.
Right.
Lucius calls it, I believe. So after he created an initial design, Nathan Crowley, the production designer, he created an initial design based on a technique called model bashing, which is where you get a bunch of models and you take parts from this one, take parts from this one, put them together and make something new out of it.
Which sounds super fun.
Yeah. I mean, it could be Nathan Crowley and a couple of engineers by the name of Chris Culver and Annie Smith and a crew of over 30 other people spent 2 months based on this design, spent 2 months carving a full-size replica of the Tumbler out of a giant block of styrofoam. And then they used this styrofoam model to create a test frame. The test frame had to meet several standards. It had to be able to reach speeds of over 100 miles an hour, had to go from 0 to 60 in 5 seconds. The vehicle's front end just collapsed and they had to be completely rebuild it.
But it was
but like the Batmobile like was like 2.5 tons on the back. It's huge.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And so they had to account for that. Like the front was so much lighter. And I mean, it's worth mentioning that like this design, David DeGloria swears that like Christopher Nolan had Play-Doh early on in their discussions and made the Batmobile exactly what it is right now. Like
I saw the model. It's pretty damn close.
He was like, this is what I picture. And it's like a Lamborghini mixed with a Humvee. Like, this is what it would look like.
Yeah.
And so he had it.
But Nathan Crowley and his engineers had to figure out how to turn that into reality and make it a moving, working vehicle.
Well, the thing that impressed me
just
about
think it's cool to think that like it was legit. Like the fucking thing was legit.
Yeah. That's the thing that impressed me about, them talking to the stunt driver and of course the engineers that built it. They were like, it can do whatever you need it to do. Like it's not one of these, it's not like, you hear those horror stories about like the DeLorean. Well, the DeLorean, already had a foot in the grave, but like on the set of Back to the Future, like sometimes it wouldn't start and it wasn't a good car, but like of all the Batmobiles that have been, not only did it look super cool, but it could do whatever you needed it. They're like, we have to spin this in this little intersection and not run into anything. The guy was like, okay, I can do that. Can the car do that? And the car.
That's George Cottle.
Absolutely. Yeah.
By the way, Todd, George Cottle, who's like a popular driver on like stunt driving. This is a guy who's legit done it all, and like
dude knows he needed it. They're like, we have to spin this in this little intersection and not run into anything. The guy was like, okay, I can do that. Can the car do that? And the car.
That's George Cottle.
Absolutely. Yeah.
By the way, Todd, George Cottle, who's like a popular driver on like stunt driving. This is a guy who's legit done it all, and like he describes like going into the Batmobile and being like, yeah, I can do this thing, but can your car do this thing?
Yeah,
like, I know how to make it do this thing. But
well, it was also really hard to drive.
For the back end weighing that much, that throws the physics way off.
Well, not only that, but it was you couldn't see out of it.
Yeah.
So they actually had to drive using video monitors. The stunt drivers had to use video monitors to be able to see where they were going. So the design and development process took like 9 months and cost several $1 million. There's a whole article about this on how stuff honors to be able to see where they were going. So the design and development process took like 9 months and cost several $1 million. There's a whole article about this on how stuff works. It's really fascinating. If you're interested, I recommend it. But after the design was complete, they created 4 street-ready cars, and some of them did, where the panels come up. Some of them, they all had kind of different specialty functions. They cost about $250,000 a piece, each of these 4 cars.
It's pretty impressive. I mean, I guess that's why they didn't like put these into mass production, but it's kind of
several reasons probably why they didn't put these into mass production.
It's kind of a wicked fucking car, but I mean, the like I remember seeing like interviews with like Katie Holmes where she's like, I totally get guys' obsession with cars. Like after seeing this one, like this is legit. And Christian Bale describing like, I get to do all of this stuff. And he's like, but I still don't. I'm like, so do I get to keep this after? Like, I get to keep this car. And Chris looked at me and was like, are you an idiot? Like, no, you don't get to keep that car. It's like, you're not going to keep it. And, but no, I mean, it's a badass car. And not only that, but it's worth mentioning, like, the car chase scenes that it's involved in. Like, this car legitimately is doing this, like you said. Like it's
I mean, there are only a couple of moments where they used like a scale model in the car chase scenes, but for the most part, that car is doing all that.
And like they made, I mean, it's worth talking about, like they made a thing, like I think they called it the Ultimate Arm. And it was like the Mercedes ML55.
I was going to say that's the only other car that's more impressive is the camera car.
Right. They had the arm coming out with the camera on the Batmobile, and you don't get the fan of movies. And so he's thinking French Connection. Like I want.
Oh, that car chase is very French Connection. Absolutely.
Yeah. He's like, I want a real car chase. And I need a place to do it. Not even to get into like they built like a whole, like a warehouse set that is like, it's not a soundstage. Like they converted a warehouse into a city, and they're doing these car chases. And generally when you get these kind of shots, it's overhead. It's like a helicopter following the cars or something. But because of this Ultimate Arm, I think that's the name of it. They have like car to car tracking. Like it's like a car fucking going right next to the other car. You're seeing like it's real time. Like this is happening. And it's I don't know. It's pretty impressive to me.
Yeah.
Well, I also like that the Tumblr has like
it's real time. Like this is happening. And it's I don't know. It's pretty impressive to me.
Yeah.
Well, I also like that the Tumblr has in the story of the film has a function that was made to create suspension bridges, which is a thing with a lot of the tech in this, because that you don't get in you don't get in any other Batman movies. He just all of a sudden has a bunch of cool gadgets, which just has. And like if you watch the Burton stuff, you're like, well, where did he get this like batarang that's got a Batman symbol? Like somebody had to make that, right? And so are they getting suspicious that they keep getting orders for something with a bat symbol on it? But in this movie, they're all kind of, he's got Lucius. Everything has a real world function. You finally get the answer to the question, where does he get those wonderful toys?
Yeah,
right. You finally know.
I was literally watching it this time, and I was thinking, like, if they had just continued with this storyline, these people and this part with these people, and they do a very good job of like explaining like how a man could do this. The caves are pre-carved, like they're already there. It's like a great grandfather's thing of like the slave trade, like he was doing the Underground Railroad or something, and it's like it's all fun, like it's. That these are pre-existing caves underneath Wayne Manor, and but you can totally predict like later on if they'd have kept along with the storyline that Vicky Vale could eventually show up again. I pieced together. I looked at all these sales documents and like all of the cargo and like she like puts together like Wayne Manor like received all of these things eventually. Like that would have been fun.
Comes into play in the next one.
Yeah.
So the film Batman Begins opens on June 15th, 2005.
Yeah.
So the film Batman Begins opens on June 15th, 2005, and was, as we all know, a major hit, a smash hit. Ultimately earned $373 million worldwide and received great reviews from critics. Audiences loved it. It was incredibly influential. I think one of the things that gets talked about, and it was especially talked about at the time, as far as the film's influence, is that it made everyone in Hollywood think that they needed to make everything dark and gritty. Right. Yeah. Which was entirely the wrong lesson to learn from this. The lesson to learn is make your movie make sense. Your audience care about the characters.
Right. Yeah,
make your audience based on make the characters the main focus of your film. Because that dark and gritty thing, obviously, it's not going to work with every character. We've seen several iterations of characters who've tried to take that approach here. Because I think the best, Todd kind of actually said this earlier, I think the best takeaway is that this film is grounded in a sense of reality.
Well, I think the best closest comparison, if you're going to talk about like superheroes, and especially if you want to like bash Marvel and DC against each other, like Batman, like Bruce Wayne and Tony Stark are probably pretty close.
Well,
like
absolutely. I mean, the way that and Kevin Feige and Jon Favreau have both cited Batman Begins as a major influence on what they were doing with Iron Man, because Iron Man, they grounded that in reality. Right. They chose a character who doesn't have any superpowers. He's rich and he's able to make the fabulous enhancement. They don't really do the dark and gritty thing. They actually took the right lesson from this, because they made Tony Stark and his deteriorating psychological movies that they started to veer into the fantastic. But when they were kind of testing the waters of, can we do this cinematic universe thing, Batman Begins was their template. This was the movie that they looked at, because this is the movie that those movies are very similar, and not necessarily in tone, but in like ideas
and approach.
Yes. Well, and can I say, like, I mean, the thing is with this is like one of the things that hit me this time. If I were to be nitpicky about this film, I mean, one of the things that I would pick apart is as a character, Batman doesn't have as much detective work involved in this film. And he sort of cracks the case, but not really.
Yeah, like he kind of falls into his lap.
Yeah, it kind of falls in his lap, and he like gets Lucius Fox to do more of the cracking of the case. And so it's like in comics, as fans of the characters, Bruce and Tony Stark do more of the cracking of the case. And so it's like in comics, as fans of the characters, Bruce and Tony Stark are similarly geniuses, but this movie fails him a little bit, because like in the Iron Man movies, like Tony Stark figures this out. And in this movie, like Bruce is relying on his cast of characters to not that it's not okay to have like a strong supporting cast, but one of the fun things,
always, maybe not always, but largely had a strong supporting cast that make up the Bat family. And so I don't think it's,
you just rely on Batman to also be able to figure out the science of this situation.
Sure. Well, I think if Bruce Wayne had come back and he was so focused on taking down and I'll say it how they pronounce it in the movie, focused on the mob, that he might have missed that. It was just kind of, I mean, Falcone is the mob connection in Gotham, so of course he's going to be involved in this deal. So because he's got everything bought and paid for, as they say in the movie. And
What's
I think
James Bond here is what I'm trying to get at. I think.
Yeah, pretty much. But I think if it had been anybody else, then he might have missed this plot. He'd have been so focused on the mob that everything would have just, blown him by. Because he's not. I do like that. He's not as sharp as someone like Tony Stark, who's quite together.
I do like that the movie places like kind of the biggest foes to Batman in this as not necessarily like a Joker or a more over the top character would be, but he's going up against a corrupt city. He's going up against the mob, like villains who are very much grounded in reality. Although, I mean, he's going up against a corrupt city. He's going up against the mob, like villains who are very much grounded in reality. Although, I mean, there are definitely some comic booky elements to this film, more so than I think this movie gets credit for, because it is, often talked about like bringing a realism. And even Christopher Nolan says this, a realism to the genre. And it does, certainly. But there's some pretty comic booky shit. Like the whole League of Shadows thing is very comic booky. The Scarecrow's hallucinogen is very over the top and comic booky. Like that's not grounded in reality. The thing that where Bruce can call in bats as backup, like that's goofy, that could, but it works. The way that it's done in the film works. But if you just on paper, that sounds like a goofy comic book thing, So the movie is a little more comic booky, I think, than people want to give it credit for. But I do think that this version of Batman, so the movie is a little more comic booky, I think, than people want to give it credit for. But I do think that this version of Batman is less of a superhero than he is a vigilante with a flair for the dramatic, which is, of course, the lesson that he learns from Ra's al Ghul.
Well, I think the approach that they take on everything else in grounding that in reality and giving explanations where they could come up with them allows the audience to buy into the comic booky stuff.
Right. Yes. I agree with that.
You know what? He's got all this other tech. Of course he has a thing in his boot that summons bats. No, and I buy into it.
Yes, exactly. But the thing is that this movie, the thing that this movie does so well, and I think that it actually, even though the later films in this trilogy ramp things up a little bit, I think this entire trilogy as a whole is really beginning to an end. Yeah. And this movie really is Bruce's story. It's not Batman's story. This is Bruce's story. Batman, as we know him, is not revealed until the second half of the movie. You don't see him in
literally
the
like over through. 40. I paused it when he's in the car ready to go, like even confront Falcone. Like it was like 45 minutes in at least. You haven't even seen Batman at this point.
No, not at all. You haven't seen any bat symbols. You haven't seen anything. You've seen a bat, but you haven't seen anything Batman related. Right. And that's because this is a movie that's more about the psychology of Bruce Wayne. It's about this broken man who's dealing with childhood trauma. That's what this movie is about. So I think that, and this is the first iteration of Batman, at least in film form, that's ever dealt with that side of the character. So I think using Scarecrow, of course, a psychologist, Dr. Jonathan Crane, works really well with that as Jonathan Crane, not as Scarecrow. He only puts on the mask like twice, maybe 3 times in the whole movie.
Well, I think it's so much better too. Like I think as
he's scary as Dr. Crane because he's literally an unfeeling sociopath.
The best, like his shining moment, possibly of any moment he's ever done in film, is like him in that warehouse, like where they're dumping the shit in the water, and he's just like, he's here. Who? The Batman. Like that's
a great delivery.
Yeah, really he's brilliant there. Like he's just and like the whole like developing like what his thought processes there is really good. Like it's
he has some really great underrated moments around that as well. I because just a few minutes before is one of my favorite moments of his, is where he's just like, this is where we make the medicine. Maybe you should have some.
Well, that the whole
it's like, oh,
sequence with him.
Just a few minutes before is one of my favorite moments of his, is where he's just like, this is where we make the medicine. Maybe you should have some.
Well, that the whole
it's like, oh,
sequence with him and Rachel, where she's discovered what's going on. Like he's chilling in those scenes. Like,
he
really is.
Like even when you know that he's like leading her out and like, this way, please. You know, like
he's he is Hannibal Lecter calm in this, and it creeps you out.
He's brilliant. Like I mean, he's absolutely perfect in this role.
Well, and using Scarecrow in this also allows Nolan to kind of flex some directing chops that I don't think he's ever used before or since, and that's that this guy should be directing a fucking horror movie.
Oh, damn it.
Yes.
Like one of my favorite parts is like one of the things I've always remembered about this movie is that warehouse scene where Falcone is like waiting out. This is okay for us to watch in October because this is a horror movie right now. Like these guys are walking around this warehouse
and just getting plucked into the darkness by some unseen force. You know?
Right. God. And he's just like, and then just like, where are you? And he's like sitting beside them here. Like pulls them up into the air.
Well, not only that, but
then you've also scary character.
But then you've also got the hallucinations, the visions that are brought on by Crane's hallucinogen. And those are terrifying. Like they really are. Like when Crane gets dosed and he sees that Batman, that demonic Batman in front of him, or later when you see like him on the horse and the horse's eyes are glowing, like it's some scary ass shit.
Yeah,
it is like terrifying, drug-induced demonic visions.
Now it really
is in a movie that is geared towards, I wouldn't say children, but younger people.
Right. Well. To go
that is geared towards, I wouldn't say children, but younger people.
Right. Well, to go to go a little bit further back, you know, in the few times that we have seen the death of Thomas and Martha Wayne, I don't think it's ever hit as hard as it does.
I absolutely agree with that.
I feel for that kid every single time, and the music, Hans Zimmer and James Newton Howard, just really with Wally's image slowly pulling away from Bruce, who just that sense of isolation and loneliness in that moment, with that music on top of it. It gives me chills every time.
Well, you also spend a lot more time with Bruce and his parents in this than you ever have before.
Yeah.
So you care more about that relationship. It's not just like a thing that happened to Batman. You feel it happen. Be a good relationship. Thomas Wayne's a good dude and he's a good father. And, you know, like the scene where he's telling, after Bruce hurts himself falling down in the well, you know, he's giving him life advice. And even like when Bruce is scared during the opera, the whole catalyst for them dying comes from a moment where Thomas he's caring for his son because he sees that Bruce is like scared. And I can't remember the kid's name who plays young Bruce, but he's really good.
Yeah. Oh, he's so good. And I looked him up and he's just like not doing anything. So
like, I mean, that happens a lot with those kid actors, but you see, and he even doesn't blame Bruce when they walk out, when the mom asks, he kind of takes it upon himself. Like he's a good guy. And you really feel it when he dies.
I'm going to tell you something that like, I mean, maybe this is not popular, but like I even looked at Joe Chill, who's played by Richard Brake.
Yes.
And God bless Richard Brake, who's Lovers, but he plays Joe Chill here. And he even dictates the scene as like a concerned, like, he's scared and he's worried.
He panics. The reason that they die is out of panic.
Yeah, it's like a whole combination of things, which later helps play into, you know, Katie Holmes trying to tell Christian Bale in the car, like, you want to go fucking kill Falcone? Like, because, you know, you could blame the guy who shot your parents, or you could blame like this guy who's fucked up the whole world. Like the city that's like preyed upon poor people like in this area that they're, he's just going to make another Joe Chill.
Yeah.
And I don't know. It's just cool.
And this is the last thing, because I'm sure we'll try to wrap this up, but
I ain't wrapping them nothing. Let's go for 4 hours.
Don't tempt me. I can talk about Batman for 4 hours.
We got,
and this is the last thing, because I'm sure we'll try to wrap this up, but
I ain't wrapping them nothing. Let's go for 4 hours.
Don't tempt me. I can talk about Batman for 4 hours.
we got 2 more episodes, so you'll have your chance.
But to Richard Brake's Joe Chill one more time, there's the scene in the courtroom where the judge says, I understand there's a member of the Wayne family here today. Does he have anything to say? Watch Joe Chill's face. You can see not only is he genuinely remorseful, but he's actually kind of scared. He's like, this might be the nail in my coffin. What is this guy going to say?
He knows that he fucked up this person's life.
Yeah. It's such a subtle performance, but like
he's
really solid.
So before we wrap this thing up, guys, I do have a question for you that is a point of controversy on this film.
It's such a subtle performance, but like
he's
really solid.
So before we wrap this thing up, guys, I do have a question for you that is a point of controversy on this film and this trilogy. What do you guys think of Christian Bale's Batman voice?
Here's the thing.
We'll get this out of the way, and then we won't have to talk about it.
I feel like it's going to especially come up in like the Dark Knight Returns or the Dark Knight, is that here's what I can say about it. There is not a fucking person that I talked to at the time of the making of this movie that had a problem with it. It became a memeable thing, which I think is a common thing that happens in today's reality, is like you make a meme of it and it's funny and you stick to it. And it's like, it makes like a clever thing.
Then it becomes your opinion.
And it becomes your opinion.
Yeah.
No, at the time that this movie happened, that was one. I talked to 100 comic book fans in a fucking Richards Comics and Collectibles who felt the same way. It was like, that's believable. You would change your fucking voice when you're Batman. And it was not a problem. Later on, it becomes memeable. And I think even like
Pete
in later
Holmes.
movies, they even like deepen it even more.
Yeah, they did. In the Batman movies, they digitally like change it.
But
like
it's
a voice
fun.
changer.
It's fun to make fun of. But it makes perfect sense. And
I got no problem with it, honestly. What about you, Todd?
To be honest, I'm right along with Gary there. And to be honest, I don't think it was that much of a change that it really made much of a difference, other than like, again, this whole thing is grounded in reality. Like,
He can't go talking around in his regular voice.
Right. Yeah. His voice is going to be, you change your voice a little. Now in the comics, they actually when he's, in uniform and all that. So this is, it's just another layer of this character. And I had no issues with it at all.
Well, the way that Christian Bale tells the story, the way that he came up with that voice was he went into audition for Warner Brothers and he had to put on the Batman suit, Val Kilmer's Batman suit. They put him in Val Kilmer's Batman suit. It didn't really fit him right. So he's like sitting there thinking like, I look like a doofus. And he's like, how am I going to do this? How do I? So he's like, all right, I'm just going to go in, and he's like, I can't do a normal voice. I have to like he says, I have to become a beast in order to sell this to myself, in order to sell it to myself more so than to sell it to them. So he does this voice. And it helps him get the part. I mean, he actually also continues to tell that story and says that he went home to his wife and he said, she's like, well, how did it go? And he's like, well, I kind of did this. And he does the voice for her. And she goes, well, you fucked that one up, didn't you?
Well, I mean, and this was something that after watching, because what I did is I watched it once just as is, and then did all the special features, and then went back and watched it with the in film features. Yeah. But I paid attention to how he stood and him crouching like a beast, like ready to
Well,
pounce.
dude, I mean,
And
that's worth mentioning. I mean, that was that was a central part to him for the suit.
Yeah.
Like when he had input, like he would, when Nolan and Bale, like they wanted him to be able to turn his head.
Yep.
Not the superhero turn your head, like where your shoulders turn with you. Like he would, when Nolan and Bale, like they wanted him to be able to turn his head.
Yep.
Not the superhero turn your head, like where your shoulders turn with you, like had been indicated in every other movie. They wanted him to be actually like functional. They wanted him to squat down. The legs had to be processed because Christian Bale thought, like, I want to be able to pounce, like, and I need to be able to, like,
gotta move.
Just
You gotta
crouch
be able to
and
move.
ready, and yeah, and he even describes like the neck was still stiff, like a panther, though. Like at any point, you were ready to like just tear somebody's eyes out, like you were just like ready, and it was just. I don't know. Like, I think that was all very functional, and so I just wanted to jump in and say that with the suit, like I think that was part of what they were thinking about. The voice, I don't know. I remember how, I think that was part of what they were thinking about. The voice, I don't know. I remember how funny everybody made the fucking voice be. But it's also like, I don't know. I was watching it this time and I was like, I love it. That like, I swear to God, this didn't happen. Swear to me. I swear to God. Swear to me.
Yeah.
Like, that's fucking scary when you're hanging upside down
totally
5
works.
stories
Yeah,
up. Like
absolutely,
that's you're like, okay, God damn it. Just don't drop me on my head.
Well, I mean, it makes me think a little bit of Kevin Conroy, who, when you listen to Kevin Conroy talk, he had to change his voice to be Bruce Wayne. He talks like Batman.
Yeah.
And, you know, most Batman fans will admit that when they read a Batman comic, you hear Kevin Conroy's voice. But it was so interesting that he actually had to change his voice to be Bruce Wayne. He had to bring it up in tone and, you know, sort of.
We saw in that warehouse scene where like that shipment is coming in and he's just like sliding out of one side and taking on a person. It's a horror movie. He's dropping down from the ceiling, pulling somebody up into darkness. Like it's when you're finally close enough to talk to the guy, the next step you have is to like make your voice sound as demonic as possible. Like you want to sound as intimidating as you can make your voice sound. I know it sounds stupid, but it's like, well, as stupid as the character of Batman could be. Like, I mean, you know, if you want Batman to be as heightened reality as possible, which is what Nolan is going for, this is that. Like it, and it really is. And I mean, yeah, again, I know we're trying to wrap this thing up, but I watched this movie again for the first time in several years, and I fucking loved this movie. I thought it was brilliant. And I think to this day, it stands up next to it. Like it feels good. Like I think Nolan made a long lasting time. Like literally watching it this time, I was like, you know, the smart thing would be to just recast Bruce Wayne like you recast James Bond and just keep these as the central part of the story.
Well, I mean, I see what you mean because this is so good, but I do actually admire Nolan and Goyer's decision to allow this story to have a beginning, middle, and end, which is something we'll get into in the coming weeks.
Yeah, as I recently came to that too, because I was a big proponent of like, hey, why didn't they just keep this going? But like watching it again, I was like, you know what?
Bruce Wayne
has a beginning, middle, and end. That's
Bruce Wayne has an arc throughout these films, which you don't get with James Bond.
Right.
James Bond.
Again, I haven't seen these movies.
Wayne
I'll take a beginning, middle, and end. That's
Bruce
awesome.
Wayne has an arc throughout these films, which you don't get with James Bond.
Right.
James Bond.
Again, I haven't seen these movies in forever. Like I really haven't. So I'm almost coming at it as new. I don't think I've seen Dark Knight Rises since theaters.
Well, you're going to see it in the next couple of weeks, Gary. Because next week we're continuing our Dark Knight trilogy series with, of course, The Dark Knight, probably the most popular and most successful of the three films from 2008. You guys know where to find it. It's on whatever streaming service you want to find it on. It's easy to find. Unlike some of the movies we talk about on this series, this trilogy at least is going to be easy for you to find.
Justin, you're a fantastic host and a narrator and all of those things. But two things. One is that I really want to establish that I think this is one of the most influential movies of the 2000s, like the early 2000s. I swear to God. Also, we haven't done a favorite segment of mine.
Oh, man, I keep forgetting about it. I keep forgetting about it. Well, Gary, let's hear it.
Well, Justin, it turns out somebody needs a nap. So
this is we should say this is our segment for those who might not have listened before since we started doing this, where Gary finds someone who does not like this movie.
It's
not only that, but 1-star reviews.
I was going to say, at least on Amazon, it's a 1-star review. Like, they are so much not a fan of this movie. I have 3 today, and I hope we can stick through it since we're just like going so in depth into Batman Begins. I hope you guys have time for it. The first one is easy. It's from Scott. That's all he gave. He said 1 star.
Thanks, Scott.
All right.
Thanks, Scott. 1 star. Here's the next one. It's from Furio. It's his name. And he says, I suppose Hollywood producers could not leave Batman alone in the current revival of every existing comic figure. Even in the last film series had always exploited most of the possibilities with one peak achievement. The beautiful Batman Returns, with the superb Michelle Pfeiffer as the deadliest and most convincing Catwoman ever. I know that was a confusing whole sentence, but it was legitimately 1 sentence in this review. So to find something new, we have here, let's go back to the beginnings. Hark! Hark! Such a novelty this is, trying to explore what was purposely left unsaid by the creators of the character. There is the usual sticky sweet story of a poor soul wronged by men and fate, who after a long wandering in the dark discovers his real self. Hark, hark! In the Far East, among kung fu teachers. There is the usual corrupted to the core, where all people are desperate, desperately evil. But
this review written by Dudley Moore.
I swear to God. I'm just reading this fucking thing.
Okay.
But where a group of righteous souls still works for the greater good, taking an airplane to some more reasonable resort. I don't even know what the fuck that means. Ethics are trite and commonplace, completely uninteresting. So is character development and interaction. Christian Bale is as intense as grated Parmesan, and so is Katie Holmes. The others are fairly good, each up to the not much required, trying to give sense to the senseless. This film appears to have many very vocal fans, but can only be seen switching one's synapses off.
I can just picture that guy adjusting his fedora as he...
Well, here's some random points I'd like to make about the movie.
Is this the same review? Are we still on the same guy?
I don't know. Let's move on to the next one. This is from Leland Palmer, and he gives like at least
Leland Palmer,
points.
the character from Twin Peaks, is writing a review of Batman Begins.
His review of Twin Peaks.
Or Laura Palmer's father is not a fan of
Leland Palmer
Begins.
says this, and he gives 4 points. Number 1, when did the bat suit make him start yelling like a WWF reject? When he's not yelling, he slips into some strange 2 packs a day for 30 years croak. Sometimes the voice is so raspy you can close your eyes and picture him on the porcelain throne, straining as best as he can, yelling like a WWF reject. When he's not yelling, he slips into some strange 2 packs a day for 30 years croak. Sometimes the voice is so raspy you can close your eyes and picture him on the porcelain throne, straining as best as he can. You even wonder if he might be on the verge of defecating from his mouth. That is seriously how hard he is trying. I'll wait for the Super Collector's Edition Deluxe Director's Cut when they redo the voiceovers and give him back his calm, menacing voice. For the time being, I'm left to giggle and or weep silently whenever he tries to talk whilst in the suit. Wow. Number 2, Nolan
that was
is
just
a
1 point. That was just 1 point.
That was 1. We got 4. Number 2, Nolan is a coward. I think there are 2 scenes. Stand still and let us look at the costume for more than 1.3 seconds at a time. I guess it doesn't matter since there are only 11 minutes of screen time left when Nolan finally gets around to letting Christian Bale wear the goddamn costume to begin with. Was he afraid the other kids would make fun of him? Was he ashamed of how it turned out? Even Scarecrow only puts his mask on for a quick burst, just barely long enough for, say, a fart to dissipate. Scarecrow doesn't even have to sneak away and change into any kind of costume. That's how lazy Hollywood has become, people.
Wow.
Number 3, Katie Holmes dials in a performance from the WB. It's moments like her, it's what's on the inside. That's what's on the inside. Well, that's not it. That have been wasted. Later in the movie, when Batman regurgitates this gem past all of the bat flims stuck in his throat, you'll be forced to question whether mankind has even the right to exist anymore. Wow. Number 4, the version of Bruce Wayne doesn't need justice and vengeance. He needs a support group and designer antidepressants. Yeah.
To be fair, every version of Bruce Wayne needed a support group.
Yeah.
There you go.
Justin, you fell down that well once. Does it really take a ninja school for you to finally come to terms with that? Are you crying? There's no crying in Batman. This Bruce Wayne isn't driven by passionate obsession that fuels the grim exploration of his limits and capabilities. This Bruce Wayne is a whining pansy who needs somebody to hold his hand and show him where the bathroom is. When I'm watching a pansy who needs somebody to hold his hand and show him where the bathroom is. When I'm watching a Batman movie, I should never feel like I want to pat him on the head and say, there, everything will be fine. Have some more milk. Is that better? Good. Now get up off your can and put the damn costume on, beat some people up, and keep your mouth shut while you're doing it.
I'm going to give him points for there's no crying in Batman. That's good. Yeah, that's good stuff.
Anyway, my point is there are a lot of people. Somebody needs a nap.
Well, thank you, Gary. And I think that wraps up our discussion of Batman Begins. We'll be back next week with The Dark Knight for Mr. Todd A. Davis. Yay. Thank you for being our special guest this week, Todd.
Thank you for making me your very special guest.
Special guest. You're just a co-host. And I'm tired of hearing that you're special. It is offending me as a person.
With The Dark Knight for Mr. Todd A. Davis. Yay. Thank you for being our special guest this week, Todd.
Thank you for making me your very special guest.
Special guest. You're just a co-host. And I'm tired of hearing that you're special. It is offending me as a person.
Are you just sad that I don't call you special every week?
You don't call me special. You never called me special. You never appreciated me as a co-host. You never appreciated what I contribute to this goddamn podcast.
Well, you do pay for the Zoom subscription, so I do appreciate that, Gary. Thank you.
God damn it. Well, hey, I'm at This Is Gary Horn.
Okay. I'm at Justin_Bishop.
I'm at Twitter. I'm at Mr. Todd A. Davis on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram,
we're trying to wrap this thing up.
Letterbox, D&D Beyond.
Thank you, Todd. Until next week.
No, listen to me. I don't think anybody fucking tuned into this episode and got more of a fucking into it because I read about this fucking movie for 2 hours at least today. Not to mention the rest of the week.
Yes, we put a lot of work into this. I was writing notes literally in my car earlier today as I dealt with a dead battery, and I had my laptop in my car with me while I waited on my battery to charge so I could write notes so we could get this podcast out to you on time.
I guarantee you, fucking Christopher
folks.
Nolan doesn't even remember as many details about Batman Begins as we just presented to you in this podcast. And I don't mean that to be a dick. Seriously, we're gracious and grateful for everybody who listens. But seriously, like let your people know.
Somebody likes Batman, send them this episode. Let them know that another one's coming next Thursday as well. We've got resident Batman expertise here on the show with Mr. Todd Davis. This is the most enthusiastic about a series that he will shit that people say at the end of podcasts because it really does help. Now can I do the thing until next week? Now can I do that?
Yeah, now's the time.
Until next week.
May the wings of liberty never lose a feather.
Be excellent to each other. Is it going to be different?
He has the keys.
He just did it in a Batman voice.
I did it. That's it. That's
He's
it.
surely going to pick a Batman phrase.
That's it. No,
You guys have to help Todd with the closing phrase. All right.
He just
Well,
did it in a Batman voice. Yeah.
this is why we don't, by the way, release the video of our episodes.
So that we can do.
This is why we don't, by the way, release the video of our episodes.
So that we can do extra takes.
Because we're all, at some point, each one of us has been caught masturbating on camera. This is disturbing.
I refuse to comment.
How does this relate to Batman, Justin?
Well,
Get back on track.
I'm hoping most